Formula One fans. This is the Formula One News Hour, and I am your host, Jonathan Steele. A quiet week in Formula One this week, not a lot going on. The biggest news was that Formula One is not going to allow Mercedes to use the new aerodynamic foils, whatever you want to call them, on the front of the cars that they had designed in the last go around. They had put special notches and little things onto the front foils on the front of the car on the left and right side, which is designed to help the downforce on the front, take away a little bit of that porpoising that you saw a lot of if you watch the Formula One. But apparently Formula One have decided that they will not be able to use that design going forward. They did put it on one of their cars for practice here in Austin at the United States Grand Prix, and they were very happy with the results. But for whatever reason, Formula One has decided no, that it is not going to allow that design to be used. Let's start this week's podcast again with thanking our sponsors. They are Thinology, L American, Give Send Go, Off the Press, Inform America, and CloudHub. Again, thank you to all our sponsors for the support that we continue to get from them, and hopefully as we gain in popularity and we gain more and more followers, then of course we'll try and add more and more sponsors, and of course we're actively looking to do that. So anyway, I guess the most exciting news for this week is we have an upcoming interview with David Coulthard. David was Formula One he was not a Formula One champion. He raced Formula One from 1994 to 2008. He did win I think 13 races, and he podiumed some 51 times. So he was a very, very, very successful driver. I guess the saddest part for David's career was, of course, about the same time as Michael Schumacher. So anyway, we're looking forward to that, and we'll have that not next weekend, but the weekend after. So this week we're going to do two things. We're going to do the history, of course, and I thought for the history this week we would have the first Formula One Grand Prix champion, who was Giuseppe Farina, and then we're going to talk about the evolution of engines during the Formula One era. There's been lots and lots of changes over the years, but it's been a very you might say a very interesting time. A lot of changes, but not a lot of changes, if that makes sense, and we'll get to that in that section. But let's talk a little bit about Giuseppe. He like I say, he was the first Formula One world champion, which was actually in 1950. Formula One was formed in 1947, but it took them 2 or 3 years to kind of get all their act together, get all the races together, and get enough races to actually have a meaningful championship. For Formula One was really developed, not developed, but organized to bring some form of fair competition to the sport, and try and put rules and regulations around it, whereby everybody was trying to do and trying to race and win races with very, very similar cars, just like the Indy cars, just like the Formula One cars of today, just like sports car racing, just like rally cars, all of these different cars. And it's true of a lot of sports. You try and put a standardized group around with the same rules, same regulations, and so it was that Giuseppe Farina became the first Formula One world champion. He was born in 1906, and he was not world champion until 1950. Now, of course, in there was the Second World War, but it was very interesting. The cars then were all front-engined. There were no rear engine cars. The rear or mid-engine car didn't come along until the late 1950s. It was actually, the first rear engine car was actually designed by Bugatti, who only entered it in one race. But that that one race impressed enough people that, you know, as it went forward, as the racing world went forward, then all the cars eventually became rear or mid-engine cars. Anyway, Giuseppe was the son of a fairly wealthy man. His father was a coach builder in Italy, and his uncle was Pino Fanina, who they are a very famous coach builder today. But his father was a famous coach builder. Now, the coach builders are the guys that put the interiors in the car. So the cars are manufactured by a single manufacturer, but the coach builders build all of the interior, all of the seats and the door panels and all of those kinds of things, and the soft tops, the convertible tops that go in there. And so that's what his father did. In fact, his father was also into motor racing, and in Giuseppe's very first race that he did, he came in fourth behind his father. His father actually won that race. And so they started back then with a lot of, they called them kind of semi-Grand Prix, but really they were cars that were designed and built differently. They were open-wheeled racing cars. They had the specially designed bodies and specially designed chassis, and of course specially designed engines to power them through there. There was a lot of wrecks in those times. In fact, in Giuseppe's career, he was responsible in the end for the deaths of about 8 to 9 people. 2 of those people were race car drivers, and 7 of those people were actually fans. When Giuseppe, fans watching a race, when Giuseppe took out in a corner, took out another Italian race car driver, that car spun off and went off the track and into the fans. Remember, back in those days, the Formula One tracks, as I mentioned before, were open, and in fact, one of the other reasons that Giuseppe took out this other driver was a 4-year-old boy ran across the track as Giuseppe was going around the corner, and so in order to miss that guy, he took out, missed that little boy, he took out another car, and the other car went off and killed 7 of the fans. So he was kind of known as a reckless driver, because of the number of, obviously, because of the number of wrecks that he had, and 2, because he was unafraid, maybe too much so, and the fact that his aggressive style of driving caused too many problems for all the other drivers. Today in the racing world, Formula One racing world, Max Verstappen has that reputation of being the young, aggressive driver that's maybe more aggressive than he needs to be. So, as we've just talked about, Giuseppe was really 46 years old. 46 or 44 years old. 44 years old when he became world champion, which, you know, not just probably 10 years later. Most of the drivers were retiring by the time that they were in their early 30s, mostly because the travel schedule was tough on them, and of course a lot of them feared for their life, because as you've heard me say during the previous podcasts, from about 1958-59 through 1975, there were a lot of drivers that lost their lives. But anyway, Giuseppe did not quit racing altogether after his Formula One career ended. He did go into sports car racing. I said he did go into, he was doing sports car racing before that, Before the 24-hour of Le Mans, there was the 24-hour of Spa, and he and Mike Hailwood, who was a British driver, won that race once and came in second another time. So he was a very successful driver. He was also very good friends and a teammate for 2 to 3 years of Fangio. In fact, when he won the 1950 World Championship, he beat out Fangio by 2 points. And the reason that he did that was that Fangio's car broke down. The car that he started the race with. Now, pay attention here. The car that he started the race with broke down. And so Ascari, who was Fangio's teammate, pulled in because to give him Fangio the chance to win the championship, pulled in to the pits and let Fangio take his car over so that he could become world champion. But unfortunately, an axle broke on that second car, and so Giuseppe became world champion in 1950. Okay, so after his Formula One career, as I said, he was into driving sports cars and doing long distance races with teammates. The other thing that he's not very well known for is that he did try to get into the Indy 500, and that was in 1956. For the Indy 500, there is essentially 4 or 5 days of qualifying, and on the third day of qualifying, Indy was hit with heavy rains, which meant that there was only so many other cars that could manage to qualify for that race, and so unfortunately for Giuseppe, he did not manage to get into the Indy 500. Now, the following year, tragedy struck when he was in an accident and had a broken arm and was trying to qualify for the Indy 500 again. And at this time, though, it decided that the pain was too much and stuff like that, and so he pulled out of that car. Another driver stepped into that car to try and qualify it for the Indy 500, and he lost it going into turn 3, and he was killed instantly when the car hit the wall. So tragedy. But as I mentioned a little earlier, that tragedy seemed to follow Giuseppe. And in fact, Giuseppe died young. He died in 1966. So he was, right at 60 years old. And he was driving through the Alps. He had, at the time, a Lotus Cortina, which was a car built by Ford, but it had an engine that was modified by Lotus. And as you remember, Colin Chapman was heading up Lotus then, and not just heading it up, he owned Lotus. Anyway, he lost control of the car, and he was killed instantly when he hit a light pole in the Alps. So I know the Alps have claimed many lives over the years, but you'd think somebody with the driving skills of Giuseppe Farina that would not have happened to him. Interestingly enough, he was married, but he did not have any children. So he left this world without leaving any heirs or anything like that. He left his wife and of course his brother. His father had died a little earlier, back in 1955. But all in all, having lived 60 years, he will always have one thing that no other person in the world will ever have, and that is I was the first Formula One world champion. And so that will be forever etched in his name. I'm sure it's on his gravestone, wherever he's buried. And so, you know, an interesting character for a Formula One driver, very old, not just old, but very old. He was obviously, he was 44 when he became world champion, so he actually started at Formula One racing when he was 41 years old. So that was not that unusual at that time. You know, like I'm saying, it was probably, or like I was saying rather, it was probably in the later 50s and early 60s that the Formula One drivers, you know, where their age came down dramatically. And part of that, of course, was because of the Second World War. The number of drivers that was available after the Second World War, young drivers, was just not there because many of the young ones had died during the war, and after the war, a lot of people were just trying to, you know, sort their lives out and get themselves back together again. It was the older guys, the guys like Fangio and Giuseppe and others, Mike Hailwood, who had been racing before the war and then went back to it after the war. And that's why you saw a lot of the guys then that they were in their late 30s to early 40s. So anyway, this portion of the Formula One News Hour has been brought to you by CloutHub. You know, guys, there has been a lot of censorship and a lot of different approaches to social media. And recently we just saw Twitter being purchased by Elon Musk, and it's trying to make it a more neutral site where lots of people can share their ideas without being censored or just taken off the platform. Well, before Elon did that, there was CloutHub. And a guy called Jeff Brain founded CloutHub. It's been around about 3-4 years now, maybe a little more, maybe 5 years. It's got a big following out there. It's a much better site than Facebook. It's got things that Facebook doesn't have. You know, it's got rooms and things like that where you can and channels where you can actually have your own channel, and so you can, like, maybe broadcast a famous rock star that you want to be and you want to put it out there, you and your group or your band or whatever your idea is, you can get onto CloutHub and put it out there. And the biggest thing, the most important thing, is there's zero censorship on CloutHub. But certainly when it comes to the day-to-day social media stuff, then you certainly want to be part of CloutHub. That is clouthub.com. Again, that's clouthub.com. Welcome, Formula One fans, to the second part of this week's podcast. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we're going to talk about the evolution of the engines, the engine designs, the different types of engines, and you know, how they're generating power today versus power back in the 1947 Formula One cars. But first, let's thank the sponsor for this segment of the Formula One News Hour, and this segment is sponsored by Moms for Liberty. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of things going on in our school systems and at the school board level over the last year to 2 years that a lot of people find very disturbing, and that is that for whatever reason schools are getting away from teaching math and English and science and history and all those things, and trying to influence children's social behaviors by introducing things like LGBT and gay and all these other types of things, and making children question, you know, are they a boy or a girl? And so the whole goal of Moms for Liberty is they want to encourage people and parents to get more involved with their children and the education of their children, and get onto these school boards and get some of these people that are pushing these ridiculous ideas out into the world on LGBT and gay and all that kind of stuff. That is not where our children need to learn that stuff. That's what parents are for. Certainly when my children were growing up, we expected to teach our children all about the different social things in life, everything from politics to the world. And there are LGBT, there are queer people in the world, but there's a place to learn about that. And the school is not that. And Moms for Liberty has over 180, 83 or 85, I think was the last count, chapters all over the United States to really help get more parents involved with the education of their children by getting the right school board members on the school boards and promoting the proper education, science, English, math, history, those kinds of things in our schools. So please go to momsforliberty.org, that is momsforliberty.org, and support the organization, join the organization, create your own chapter, and of course they're always looking for donations. So again, that's momsforliberty.org. Okay, so let's talk about the Formula One engines of yesteryear and the Formula One engines of today. And you know what the interesting thing is, I think I mentioned back a little while ago, that the first production cars to use 4 valves per cylinder was Lotus. That was part of the Lotus kind of engineering ingenuity, you might say. But what's really interesting, if you were to look at engines, the base engine of even back in the I think it was 1926, and Lincoln designed a 4 valves per cylinder V8 engine. Now think about that, 1926. Now today, most of your cars are being powered by an engine that has 4 valves per cylinder. So we're talking over 130 years, and the technology of an engine, the internal combustion engine, is very, very similar to what it was all those years ago. And so we'll ask yourself, well, why would that be? And the answer is quite simple. There's not a lot of different things you can do to an internal combustion engine, other than trying out different sizes of the pistons, different lengths of the stroke inside the cylinder. There was a Swiss company back in the middle 1970s, and what they did was they changed the design of the cylinder head so that when the piston came up, so fuel gets put into an engine. In the old days it was carburetors, so you've got air and fuel going into the cylinder, and in most engines it just sits there until the piston comes up, and the spark goes off, causes this explosion, which forces the piston down again with such force that the next time the piston comes up, it's pushing all of the waste gases out of there. And oh, by the way, before we had all of the electronic controls on the engines that we have today, a lot of that gas, some 30 to 40% of all of the gas that got injected into the engine came out the exhaust tailpipe. Anyway, this Swiss company had this really interesting idea. What they thought was, instead of just having the piston come up, get those stagnant air-fuel mist, it would be like a mist inside the cylinder, and instead of having it just compress as the piston came up, they put these tiny grooves, cut tiny grooves into the cylinder head. Inside there's like a little dome area inside the cylinder head, and inside there they cut these grooves so that as the fuel was forced up, it was forced into a spinning motion. So literally the fuel was spun very, very quickly. And this caused two things. It caused the engine to develop more what we call brake horsepower, because that's how we really measure the capabilities of an engine. You'll hear a lot of people talk about horsepower, but when we really talk about the power of an engine, we talk about the brake horsepower. Okay, John, what's the brake horsepower? Well, think about this. You see truck drivers doing this, big trucks doing this. You see lots of car drivers doing this, not so much over here in the United States where there's mostly automatic transmissions. Of course, you see all the Formula One drivers doing this. As they're coming up to a corner, as they're lowering speed, they change down the gears. Now the engine becomes an integral part and a major part of braking, of slowing down that big truck, or slowing down that Formula One car, slowing down your saloon car. Even if you take the automatic transmission, put it in manual mode and shift it, you can use the engine to slow down the car. And so when we're talking about brake horsepower, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the engine's ability to act as a brake. And so for race cars especially, that is a much more important factor than the horsepower, how fast, how much power it goes, in a forward direction. We really want brake horsepower because that's really giving us the full effect of the engine. And so back to what we were talking about with the swerving things that they did in the cylinder, the Swiss, that developed more brake horsepower, but also more fuel was burned. And you get more brake horsepower because more fuel was burned, right? So less fuel was going out the exhaust tailpipe. So this technology evolved very much so over the following years. And we'll finish that story in a minute, because what I want to get back to is in the Formula One engine world, when Formula One put some design constraints, and that's all Formula One does, is build constraints, constraining all of the car owners to build a car that is very much the same thing. So in the early days of constraining, they merely put a liter, a 4.5 liter, 3 liter, 1.5 liter. Sometimes you'd see that measured out in cc, so you'd say, it was 1500 cc, so that's a 1.5 liter. Whenever you talk about motorcycle engines, you mostly talk about, is it a 500 cc, is it 750 cc? That's because the size of the engine hasn't got up to 1 liter. So anyway, in the early days, what they did was the very first ones had a limit of 4.5 liters. Okay, in actual fact, that is a very large engine. Okay, not quite the size of a truck engine, but the very few sedan cars that you pick your mom and dad up and go to dinner in, would ever have an engine that big. The muscle cars of the late 60s and early 70s, yes, some of those guys had, in fact, they had 5 and 6 liter engines in them. But for the most part, a 4.5 liter engine was very large. Now, what they didn't say was, they didn't say how many cylinders it could have, or how many valves per cylinder, or anything like that. All they said was, regulated to this size of an engine. And that actually went on for a number of years. And so you had a number of manufacturers that experimented with, should I build a V10 engine? Should I build a V8 engine? And so the different manufacturers, engine manufacturers, and a lot of times back then, remember, the teams themselves, and actually still today, a lot of the teams, Ferrari, Red Bull, Mercedes, build their own engines, and then they sell those engines to other racing entities. So after a while, they thought to themselves, we really need to constrain it more. We need to put more constraints around it because of course what was happening was the engines were too big for the cars, guys were dying and cars were breaking up into pieces. At one time, I think I mentioned this, BRM had a V16 engine. And of course, the car never made it more than 2 or 3 laps because the engine had so much torque to it that it would just literally tear the transmission to shreds. So they started putting around more constraints, and one of the first things they started constraining was the size of the cylinder and the RPM, right? So when you look at the design of an engine, there's 2 or 3 things that you can do to develop more brake horsepower. And as we've talked about in earlier podcasts, the more RPM that you can develop, then the greater the horsepower brake horsepower that you're going to develop. But the more important thing is the greater the torque. So on the average car engine, if you look on your dashboard, you've got a tachometer, and you'll see that typically it'll go to 6,000. There'll be a 6. That's actually 6,000. And then it will go to 7, and there'll be a little orange mark, and then it'll go to 8, and it'll be red. Okay. Now the reason for that is valve bounce. So to make the valves return to their sitting position, there's a spring in there. So when the camshaft turns around, pushes the valve down, then the spring pushes it back up before the cylinder comes up and hits it. So what the engine designers started thinking about was, why don't we make the cylinders bigger in diameter and the stroke shorter? Because you can't take an engine that has, say, a 6-7 inch stroke and think it's going to stay together at 10,000-11,000 RPM. It's not going to. But if you could shorten that stroke to 2 or 3 inches, or maybe in some cases 4 inches, but the whole goal here is to make the cylinder itself bigger and shorten the stroke. You're getting more fuel inside that bigger cylinder, more air. And then of course today we use devices to force the air in there. Then we can develop more brake horsepower, and more importantly, more torque. Because the torque is how we get up to speed again when we come out of the corner. So we're going to use the brake horsepower to help slow us down into the corner, and then we're going to use the torque to help accelerate us out of the corner. And so we want to get as many RPM as we could. And so the early engines of that time, they were getting 10 and 11,000 RPM, which is what you see coming out of your NASCAR cars today. So this turned out to be quite a good idea. And as we went into the 50s, a new invention came along. Back during the Second World War, Mercedes and Volkswagen were working on aircraft engines. And of course the problem for an aircraft engine is, if you're using a carburetor, trying to get fuel to maintain fuel going into that engine, when you're flying along nice and level, it's fine. But the minute you kind of turn upside down, or you turn too far to the right or too far to the left, there was always the problem of keeping the constant fuel. So they came up with what we call fuel injection. Now in the early days, fuel injection was all mechanical. I would say it was mechanical well into, I'm going to say, the late 60s, early 70s. I think the early 70s, the first electronic fuel injection systems started coming out. But so now that they were able to use fuel injection, they could actually start measuring the exact amount of fuel needed much better than through a carburetor. Because with a carburetor, you're literally, sucking the fuel, using the vacuum pressure of the inlet manifold to suck fuel out of the carburetor. And that was done through a tiny little valve inside the carburetor that had a hole in it. And the different size hole in that little valve meant the different amounts of fuel came out. But the problem with that was that there was times when you wanted more fuel and there were times when you wanted less fuel, and it was much harder to regulate that in a carburetor. So in the late, I think it was 1956, that Mercedes entered the first fuel-injected engine. So now they had this kind of distinct advantage because they were able to put in a more precise amount of fuel. But the other more important thing, when you're using vacuum to suck the fuel from the carburetor, you're going to get varying amounts of fuel into the combustion chamber based on the amount of vacuum pressure in the inlet manifold. By using direct fuel injection, then the exact same amount of fuel could be put into the combustion chamber at exactly the right time. So now we're not injecting the fuel or having the fuel come in through the inlet manifold. Now we're injecting the fuel directly into essentially on the inlet side of the inlet valve. So instead of relying on vacuum pressure to suck fuel through, we are now taking fuel and injecting it in directly. So, and we're now able to adjust and make sure we're injecting the right amount of fuel. So now the Mercedes-powered cars, and that, by the way, that advantage only lasted for a year or 2 years, because once the secret's out, and pretty soon, I think it was probably back in the early 1960s, Alfa Romeo was putting on electronic fuel injection. Peugeot, the French company, I'm sorry, not electronic fuel injection, but mechanical fuel injection. And Peugeot, the French company, were putting in mechanical fuel injection systems. In fact, if you ever watch the movie The Graduate, there's a little Alfa Romeo Spider in there, and that car has mechanical fuel injection in it. Little side stuff there. Anyway, so what is now happening is they're gaining more brake horsepower and more torque coming from the engines, right? And so as this technology developed, then the gods at Formula One started looking and saying, so how do we start constraining this, right? And right as they were talking about constraining it, another remarkable little invention came along called the turbocharger. And so now the manufacturers were combining the mechanical fuel injection, right, with forced air going into the manifold. So now the cars were getting faster and faster and faster. But in a lot of ways they were too fast to keep them on the ground, right? Because remember that you put air underneath something, and sooner or later it's going to take off. So then it's about 1965, 66, I'm thinking, maybe a little later. Colin Chapman came up with ground effects. So in the beginning, this was a great invention, and it's in fact the basic design of ground effects is how they keep Formula One cars on the road today. So the gods at Formula One decided, okay, well, we're going to reduce the size of the engines. So they came up and said, okay, what we're going to do now, you can't have 4.5 litre engines, you can only have 2 litre engines, right? So then the manufacturers came back and said, well, okay, 2 litre engines, then we have to mandate that everybody uses turbochargers. And so turbochargers were mandated as a requirement of part of the constraints. If you remember one of my podcasts, I talked about how Ken Tyrrell was fighting the turbocharger because he had actually found a way and developed, his engine supplier had found a way to develop better brake horsepower and better torque without a turbocharger. But anyway, they mandated in turbochargers and 2 litre engines. And actually, that didn't last long. It was a short-lived mandate. And they went back to naturally aspirated, meaning you can't use a turbocharger. Okay? So we went from naturally aspirated to turbochargers to now you can't use turbochargers. And this was probably one of the longest spells of engine design constraints in Formula One. Now, what's very interesting over this time is that the advancement and changes in the technology was such that the designers were now finding that they could get more power out of a 4-cylinder and a 6-cylinder engine than they could the big V8s, V10s, and so forth. Now, this is after the era of Cosworth, the Ford Cosworth engine, which was probably one of the most successful Formula One engines. Just about everybody that was anybody used that Cosworth engine, and it was in the Indy 500 cars, and it was in lots of other cars. But remember, Formula One's whole goal, or they see their whole goal, is trying to make the whole field exactly the same. So if we were to strip apart that Formula One engine of the 1970s and 1980s and lay it out on the ground, with the exception that some of the engine manufacturers were trying 5 valves per cylinder instead of 4, but if we left the five valves per cylinder off the table and we just took the 4 valves per cylinder and we laid on the floor next to the 1926 Lincoln V8 with 4 valves per cylinder, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. You wouldn't know which one was 1926 and which one was 1966 or 68. So all of this work and all of this ingenuity going into making engines really didn't advance that far. Now, yes, the Lincoln engine was what we call a long stroke. So the tie rods were longer, the pistons were smaller. So yes, you could see those differences, but that would only an experienced eye would start picking those differences up. For the most part, they were pretty much the same. So then it was the Renault company, and I think in the early 80s, came out with another design, and it had a turbocharger. Now, just a few years before, they'd outlawed the turbocharger. But the Formula One gurus looked at it and they thought it's going to be hard because it's a smaller engine and it takes up kind of less space. It for the size, for everything, the weight and everything. What we'll do now is we'll start constraining weight, and we'll constrain some of the other things, like we're going to constrain them to 15,000 RPM. Because the technologies to really power engines at 15,000 RPM were not yet developed. That comes in a few years. And so there was a lot of work went into valve spring design and all those things. Because remember, an engine turning at 15,000 RPM, that means the pistons are going up, or it's going around and around, the pistons are going up and down 250 times per second. Think about that. 250 times per second. Valves are opening and closing. 250 times per second. So now this introduced a whole another array of challenges. And the Renault design was adopted. In fact, Renault, if you go back into especially the middle 80s, stuff like that, Renault really dominated. Other folks used their engines, but Renault really dominated. When I say Renault, I'm talking about the Renault engine, but also the Renault car. But the Williams team was using Renaults. The McLaren cars were using Renaults. There was a lot of the teams that were using the Renault engine. It was very successful. But one of the things that you'll notice as we keep going and we do these podcasts on Formula One, and I think I've mentioned this before, is that you tend to see these surges in dominance and then they fade off. Good example, last year for Mercedes. Didn't win a race. Actually, that's not true. They won one race. It was Lewis Hamilton that didn't win a race. But Mercedes went from dominating to falling off. And back in the early 2000s, 2004, 2005, 6, 7, when Sebastian Vettel was winning the world championships, Red Bull was dominating. So the 80s was the domination of the Renault engine. So as we started moving now into the late 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, there's some other things that have crept in that make engine design and performance even more important. And that is the transmission. So this is the time when an engineer at Ferrari decided it's taking these drivers way too long to change gear. You know, when you think about it, you push the clutch in, you rev the engine, push the clutch in, get it out of gear. So it's taking, 1.5 seconds sometimes changing gears, an average of say 50 times. So the Ferrari engineer thought to himself, I've got to find a way to make this a much faster process, right? So that's where the paddle shifter came from. It's a semi-automatic transmission. It's got an electronic clutch, and it doesn't have a gear lever. The gear lever is gone. So now we've got a paddle shifter on the left and two paddle shifters on the right, or whichever, if you're left-handed, right-handed, whichever one the driver wants. So now what's going on is the need for even more torque coming out of the corners and more brake horsepower. So as this need grew, there was another need, and that need, which is really what is dominating Formula One today, is the need for downforce. Remember, these cars weigh 1,000, 1,200 pounds. They don't weigh very much. You see when they come in to change the tires, the guy in the front, the guy in the back, they pick it up, boom, they do it, all of a sudden change four wheels and off they go again. So they had to find a way with this need for greater brake horsepower and greater torque. Because the reason they need that is because now the time that you think about shifting down in gears gets reduced. Because now instead of taking 1.5 seconds to change gear, we're down to 1/4 of a second. And as we come out of the corner, same thing applies. So we've got to find a way to make the advantage that we've just gained, we've got to find a way to make the cars stay on the ground better and to use that torque as we come out of the corners. We're not worried about the car staying on the ground when we're coming out of the corners. We're worried about the car staying on the ground, going down the straightaway, braking and stuff like that. So then a lot more emphasis was being put back now onto the design of the chassis of the car. And the leading designer in chassis design today is a guy who studied under Colin Chapman, and he currently works for Red Bull. Now, it's going to be no secret if I tell you that he used to work for Mercedes. So this is probably the highest paid guy in Formula One next to the drivers. He's a British guy. So anyway, so now the emphasis is being put on chassis design and stuff like that. And lo and behold, they start getting the downforce that they've been looking for. But of course, the greater the downforce, then the greater the need for brake horsepower and for torque coming out of the corners. And so as they slowly changed the design of the engines to accommodate this, you know, they experiment with piston shape, and you know, some of the pistons in these engines. This is one of those areas where, of course, it's not a round pin in a square hole, but a lot of these pistons, when they're inside that cylinder and they're cold, they're actually oval. They're not round. No, think about that for a second. As they get hot, they round out. So anyway, the engineers then started thinking about, you know, we seem to be able to get the brake horsepower that we want, but we're kind of lacking on the torque, right? So what do we do? So we went through a whole period in the early 2000s, the late 90s, early 2000s, where we really experimented with the design and how how we can get more out of this engine. Well, one of the things that they did was they convinced Formula One to start letting them put not just petrol or gasoline into the cars. They started letting them put something of a much greater octane to get a much hotter spark and a much more spontaneous spark. So now 25% of the fuel that goes into these cars is, for want of a better word, alcohol, right? It's not alcohol like you drink. It's a specially formulated high octane fuel. We call it alcohol. That burns at 2600 degrees. So one of the problems that this caused was the amount of heat coming out there and going back through the turbochargers is causing a problem. And of course now we've moved from mechanical fuel injection to electronic fuel injection. But the problem is that you can't have the fuel too hot as that piston comes up, because if it's too hot you have a lower burn efficiency. So you want to have kind of a cooler fuel. So then they had to design a mechanism that would cool the fuel down as it was going into the engine. So they put the fuel through a little compressor, kind of like your air conditioner on a car, cools it down. But when we were cooling the fuel down and we were taking some of the engine power away to run that compressor, then we were losing some of the torque coming out onto the corners. So it was about 2009, I'm thinking, they started experimenting with the new hybrid engines that we have today. So the whole idea around the new hybrid engines, and in fact they don't call a Formula One engine an engine anymore. They call it a power pack. The reason they call it a power pack is because when they discovered that there was a lot of kinetic energy that being generated with the downforce and the braking of the cars coming into the corners. So they started thinking about, well, how can we capture that energy and use it when we come out of the corners, or use it when we need to pass somebody. And that's why if you watch Formula One today, you'll hear things like, oh, he's recharging his batteries. And in actual fact, he's recharging his batteries. Right under, say, I would say, the part of the car when the driver is sitting in the seat, right in front of that seat, there's a battery just like you have in the electric vehicles. And I say just like, obviously it's not just like, it's specially designed, and it's got special properties that allow it to then, we can take that stored battery and push it through to a hybrid motor and force that with the engine and the generator pack coming from the battery power, then we're able to get that torque back to come out of the corners or to pass when needed. So now what we've got is we've gone from a normal engine with turbochargers and stuff like that on it. Now we've got this power unit. So one of the other things that started happening, remember I said the greater the RPM, then the greater torque that you can get out of the engines. So now, as we develop this power pack, now we're wanting engines to turn at 20,000 RPM. And they were doing that, but Formula One, again, putting their constraints, and they've limited that now to 18,400. Now, how do you get an engine, an internal combustion engine, to spin at 20,000 RPM? There's no valve spring around that can ever make that happen. So what they developed was they developed a pressurized system to become the valve spring. So these cars don't, quote unquote, or these engines I should say, they don't have valve springs like your car has in it. The one you're driving around the road today still has valve springs. And they can't do valve springs because remember what I talked about, your little tachometer, you get valve spring bounce. You get valve spring bounce, bang, your piston or your valve goes through the top of your piston. If you're unlucky. If you're lucky, the valves will just bounce and they'll get forced back in there other than doing some pitting damage on the top of the piston. But for the most part, you over rev it, then boom, you're going to have serious damage. So they developed a pressurized chamber in the cylinder head. Well, 4 of them, right? Because it's 4 valves per cylinder. And this pressurized chamber, which is also fed now from the compressor to a certain extent, not all, because some of it is just that container is pressurized, but somehow you got to try and maintain it. So they use these pressurized containers in place of the valve springs, and now they're getting the 18,400 RPM out of the engine, right? So the whole goal of the power packs and the engines and this whole design, you're not going to believe this, is to try and gain 1 to 2 milliseconds per corner. That's the whole goal. If I can get 1 to 2 milliseconds per corner more out of this car, then we can win the race. Now, of course, we've got to have a driver capable of doing that. But as you've heard me say before, I think that the drivers are less and less an important part of winning the race as the team. In fact, it's been proven over the last few years that the team is the most important part. A good example of that was a couple of years ago, before George Russell was put into the Mercedes team full time this year. He was driving for was it Williams or maybe I think he was driving for Williams as a driver for the Williams, and then Lewis Hamilton got COVID, and they put George Russell into Lewis Hamilton's car. Guess what? It went just as fast as when Lewis Hamilton was driving it. He would have won that race if not for a mix-up on the team side, whereby they put the wrong tires on. But that kind of emphasized my point that the team is a lot more part of winning the race than the driver. So it's going to be interesting to see what comes down. There's a new engine design coming up for 2026, new engine constraints and everything. And we just by chance spent a lot of time and have direct contact with one of the team's technical directors on building the engines. So while we're not going to push him for technical details, we're going to ask him during an interview to kind of spell out some of the differences between the power packs of today and the power packs for 2026. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this little podcast on engines and engine performance and the changes and differences over the years. And of course, we'd want to thank F1NH for sponsoring this part of our program. These engines pump out, and the cars pump out, a tremendous amount of data. You need somewhere to store data. F1NH is a data center located in Austin, Texas, with a public and private cloud and co-location space. So if you need somewhere to store your data, somewhere to build your website, somewhere to do some engineering work, or you want to just have an entity just take over your entire IT infrastructure, put it all into a data center, and just have your workers work remotely from anywhere, then F1NH is a company that you need to call. It's F1NH.com. Again, that's F1NH.com. And of course, we can't finish a podcast without thanking our producer and technical guru, Andre Kuhn. That, like I say, even in this week's podcast, there's been a few things that Andre will take out and make it seem like I'm just an incredible podcaster that never makes mistakes and doesn't trip up and all those kinds of things. And of course, that's not true. So until next week, I hope you have a great week, and we will see you then.